Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We're trying to work out our hybrid tech here. Are you? I am on, not muted. Trying to see how we can show me. Are you? Are you? No. I don't know. Is everybody that's in our Zoom muted? If you're not, let's make sure everybody's muted. I'm gonna have Augie mute. Let's see, that's muted. Thank you guys for our patience while we work out our tech here. Oh, is that it? It's just not showing me on the view. Do the view all. Do the view all? Should we try that? The view's all. What's that? There's a button for you as the host to mute everybody. Yeah, asked, stop video. Okay, there's Gillian. Okay, so do you see Gillian in there? We're gonna do this. Oh. We do. Usually I get to be like Vanna White when I'm up here. I'm just making sure the video is on. We'll do more and then oh, I said stop video. Gallery should try that. Well, there we go. We can do that. There, that works. Okay, we'll go with this. Okay, thank you guys. Welcome, welcome everybody on Zoom. Thanks for being here. My name is Angela Two Stars. This is Juliana Enright before they take off. I'm the director of All My Relations Arts, which is a project of the Native American Community Development Institute. And welcome to our third and final event of our Native Authors Program. Yay! So tonight we're going to be hearing from our final 4 authors. We have Gillian Joseph, who will be joining us virtually on Zoom. We have Poupart, yes, all right, Tara Widner, and then Tara Perron. See, I did it. I practiced that too. They will be sharing the works that they've been working on over this cohort that we've been a part of since October. So those of you that are unfamiliar, our Native Authors Program is currently in our 2nd cohort, and it is a program that supports all aspects of development of Native authors and genres of fiction, nonfiction, children's literature, poetry, and young adult fiction. And this is a cohort model of 8 to 12 people. This cohort, we have 12 writers who've been working since October. They meet monthly and they're able to develop topics, professional development on all aspects of being having their work published. So the goal is to have more voices, Native writers sharing our stories and having more of those works published. So it's been a great program. I'm really proud and excited that we've been able to have this now in our 2nd year at All My Relations. And it's just been a wonderful group of writers. I'm so impressed with the variety and diversity of the stories that you all are sharing. And so, yeah, thank you all for being here. And I'm just going to turn it over first to Gillian, who's going to be sharing her reading virtually. So we'll see how that goes. We'll try it. Thank you all for being here. Sorry, that hurt. Can we go ahead and try Gillian? Test. I don't know where the audio
can you hear me?
Out of, so can you go ahead and share?
Yep. You can hear me okay? Hopefully my mic is okay.
Can't hear her. Hold on, we're gonna test out your audio. You're muted. Ask to unmute. I'm gonna.
Okay, how about now? One second.
All right, what about now?
Who's like super skilled at
It should be.
Zoom?
It was just playing through.
Augie is talking. No.
Is it
Do we need to turn this up? Is this not muted, maybe?
Can you say something, Gillian?
yes? Can you hear me now?
Can you try it again, Gillian?
Yes. Hopefully this works.
All right.
Still playing through my own thing, but that's okay.
Here?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, speak.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Hopefully this works. I'm calling from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm sad I couldn't be there in person, but hopefully if all goes well, then I'm very grateful to be able to join on Zoom.
Hard to hear. I know.
So I'm going to read from a short story that I've been working on. It doesn't have a title and it's not finished, so we'll see how it goes. Yeah.
A little bit, I know. I'm not sure where the speaker is at here. Where did you want to go? Do you know where your speaker is at on your laptop? Like if we held the microphone up? Okay, I don't know, this might be the best we can do. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Okay. Okay. I really hope that this will work. But yeah, I'm gonna read from a short story that I've been working on that it's not finished or titled or anything. So yeah. I am the architect of the nymphs. My house is half modest, residing at an elevation of 5,315 feet. The other half is lavish habitat, floor made of burrowing soil and roots of grains, stringently monitored moisture levels, a sandy riverbed, fresh air circulating with not so much as a sliver open to the outside world. Terrarium inspired and guided by knowledge seized at a glacier excavation. My grandmother recalled to me the chlorine blue of its slow dripping belly, alpine frost creeping in over the body's horizon in numbing millimeters, carefully working with a razor's edge against a weakening exoskeleton, pursuing moss-mold bodies that had somehow avoided the fate of putrefaction or processing. She would take to sitting after some years, during which she laid down offerings for the insides to show themselves, or at least part with this one tiny thing. Singing prayers to a mass of rapid waters, may they churn still, yes. The gracious waterfalls translated this one spring morning as the sun burned out of sync. Finally, the harvest had come. The transport box was a collage of ice, with slabs of varying thickness to line the basin and sides, finely crushed chunks around each specimen, and druzy particles dusting the exterior. My grandmother hoisted it to her hip each afternoon as the light found new angles, carried it like a toddler back to her campsite. It rested in the corner of the tent, atop a frozen altar that she cleaved and replaced again and again. She held vigil from her cot, which stood between the box and the entrance. Surely she had not gone this far to be thwarted by men entertaining themselves with a title ending in gist. There would be no one to steady her or her life's work. Not yet. Once she had collected a burdensome enough weight, my grandmother made the hike back to her home. Slow but not treacherous, she descends, thinking of the next step. She will unthaw them by degrees, tempering their vessels for a new reality. They had already been aided in the process of awakening by their cycled Sierra journeys. My grandmother wondered about their thoughts. She was immovable on arguments surrounding their cognition. She dreamed with open and shut eyes about those last minutes. A gale akin to a periodic comet no one of this generation had recorded, cutting abruptly from the east in ambush. Foreign air coursing through, crystallizing alveoli, the last exchanges nearing ever closer. And then she supposed, quiet. A singular conviction seethes and pools within the shared mind as the chattering halts. Return. Arrived at the cabin, my grandmother would speak to them as the ice was let out a bit each 6 or 8 hours, the delicate art of acclimatization. Similarly to her books of field notes, they never knew English's slurry. She could sense its looming exponential reproduction and implemented another safeguard against those people whose tongues it belonged to. Those people who were lurking in her shadow. Furthermore, she stood astute in her belief that they could only be comfortably coaxed awake with recognizable sounds. So she conversed with them in Dakota. My grandmother scaffolded hypotheses about how long the revival would take onto the stories she heard about different creatures and plants' hibernation. Annotated margins mapped her equations considering vast variables of torpor, none of which were ever deemed usable. She was their caretaker before they could recognize her face, constantly watching over them, but never playing creator. My grandmother didn't believe in trial and error. She refused to raise them just to see if they might survive in the environment she'd built. Creeping towards freedom from their permafrost holes, they let her in on their secrets. As their forms started to cast off distortion, she indexed more precise measurements and proportions to better anticipate their needs. These were compared to mythology and collaged together with assumed taxonomic relatives, the type of scientific validation necessary for navigating uncharted territory. Their enclosure was fashioned with approximations, drawn and improved upon with scrutiny, so well made that it is still the foundation of their habitat today. My grandmother often realized that she was holding her breath in hopes of hearing stirring noise, and tried to busy herself with tiny adaptations. Nothing was insignificant in the course of their renewal. This was her chance. A day came when they sat cool and damp in gray subdued light. They understood my grandmother's faint humming as she packed earth around transplanted rhizomes and wanted to answer her. Each joint ached with consequences of emergence and memories of suspension. They would call to her another time. When they felt the highest sun, my grandmother was in ceremony. They sung her back to them in the evening. She shed brackish tears of hope as she listened to them and praised their strength with fervor. Sealing the single remaining entryway to their habitat was a long-awaited rite, the acknowledgement that her dreams were materializing. It was time to take leave from the building and focus on the sustaining. Reap days of viewing them through the glass theater, a life cycle restarted. If not self-sufficient, at least encroaching on it. This was her first generation, her dearest, the beginning. They basked in the hot, unfettered sun for weeks before venturing underground. With full bellies, they entered the gritty media in clusters, expeditions to find their favorite spots. My grandmother meticulously noted preferences, along with the locations and partners of the 28 creatures on a large handmade map. In the autumn, some burrowed down a final time before becoming territorial. It would be almost a year until she was introduced to the nymphs. Nobody in my grandmother's life would ever know where she periodically retreated to. Not her husband or children's many children. Not until me. At 7 years old, I was keenly interested in the beings existing at my eye level or lower. I would kneel whenever I saw grass quivering to search for the reason behind it. I wasn't hoping to capture anything, only observe. I asked the animals questions out loud. What is your purpose? Where are you headed? How do you survive? Occasionally, my grandmother would chime in with another inquiry to accompany mine, to show me we share something less tangible than a family name. The two of us were bound by our perception of the natural world. our awe of its power continuously toiling to direct history. I remember the scent of day-old rain when my grandmother invited me to see them. We drove a ways and then walked a distance that felt never-ending to an impatient child. My feet operated separate from my mind, which was consumed with the mystery rapidly nearing its end. Possibilities were shuffled and stacked. She didn't have to tell me to keep the secret for her because it was becoming my secret too. I was certain about that after I peered through the window and feasted my eyes on a small dark cloud. Vibrating, it was a collection of movement, erratic yet contained by its self-imposed bounds. I swore that the air entering my lungs was buzzing. The cloud moved in dizzying patterns, and I was afraid to look away when my grandmother told me to follow her inside for a better view. We watched the cloud for hours until it suddenly dissipated into the ground. I let out a shriek, begged my grandmother to bring the cloud back. They do everything on their own terms, she told me. I made a portal with my hands pressed up against the glass border in her house as I processed what she'd said. They. What were they, if not a collection of droplets? Instead of asking her directly, I studied the grass, waiting for a telltale tremble. When it came, I crouched down, desperate to discern what grew precious in my grandmother's heart. A body sprung up, transforming my sight. I blinked and recognized the kaleidoscope of eyes that had been looking back at me. From then on, I would go with my grandmother nearly every time she went to visit them. I felt chosen, but not out of favoritism. This was simply the extension of our bond that had formed years ago. No one in our family tried to interrogate me. There was an unspoken agreement that my grandmother's domain was hers to do with as she pleased. And I would be the person to take over her realm when it was time. Until then, each visit was an opportunity to learn about the creatures. There was never leisurely time to survey the creatures like there'd been during that first visit. I was thrown into all aspects of their care, overseeing the vegetation, collecting supplies, and putting together increasingly innovative contraptions to improve the quality and temperature regulation of their water and air. My grandmother gradually built up my knowledge as their lives carried on. I reached a turning point in my training by the early summer, after weeks of preparations were undertaken to welcome a new generation. Excitement bled into our tasks, frenzying our hands and chatter. My grandmother promised me that this would change me by illuminating the path forward. I had a premonition and shot up straight in bed before my grandmother could wake me herself. In hushed tones, she instructed me to get dressed, bring the overnight bag I'd pre-packed, and meet her by the truck in 15 minutes. I beat her out and leaned against the passenger side door, gazing at my shoes. They were coated in dew, entrancing me with their soft, moonlit glimmer. It was time. My eyes were trained on the sand flanking the miniature river that ran through their enclosure. The minuscule movements of the grains were barely detectable, but my grandmother told me what to watch for and where. They appeared during sunrise, barely pinpricks. I knew I wouldn't be able to get a good look at them until they were a bit older and had molted a few times. That didn't matter to me, because they were alive and carrying on their ancestors' legacy in the same way that I was. We were running parallel existences. Anticipating my reaction, my grandmother was eager to inform me that I'd be taking on the role of their principal caretaker. I waded through floods of joy to hug her, and she squeezed me proudly before putting her hands on the sides of my shoulders and pushing me back gently. At arm's length, she could look in my eyes and see my resolve. I was ready to usher in the nymphs. Reflecting on the initial cycles feels idealistic. The dangers were mainly natural, not yet careening into the man-made. We didn't need to be as cautious with our energy consumption, fend off rumors, or construct a facade of stonework and a labyrinth of lore about an eccentric elder who loved rare plants. I wasn't educated on wildlife regulations and the concept of legality. I was too busy soaking up my grandmother's teachings and learning about removal, relocation, and extinction. And that is what I have. That's it. Hopefully you were able to hear me the whole time.
Sorry.
The long pause was scary.
Sorry, thank you for sharing. I had a little tickle in my throat, I had to get a drink. All
No
right.
worries.
Did you, I can't remember, did you share a little intro about yourself before you started reading? I know we were having a tech problem, so were you able to share
Oh no,
about yourself?
I wasn't sure if you could.
All that stuff? Do that before? we-
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so my name is Gillian Joseph. I'm Ihiktowa in Midwauketon, Dakota. And I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where I'm at now. Yeah, I'm a storyteller. I write mostly poetry and like speculative and horror fiction. And I also work in the mental health field with a focus on indigenous health sovereignty. It's a mouthful. Yeah, beyond that, I don't really know what else to say about myself. But I just want to say that I'm really grateful to Art and Angela and to all my relations for this program. It's been really great and a really good way to feel inspired and get some writing done actually around people that all share kind of an understanding about what we're writing about, and it's been really great. I think that's it on my end.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm glad you could be here with us virtually. Let's see. So next, our next writer we have sharing with us is Tara Perron. I'm gonna let you guys do your self-introductions. Come on up, Sarah. Yeah, okay.
Hello. Bonjour. I'm going to introduce myself in Dakota and then I will translate in English. Hamidakuyapi chante washte nape chijiape damakota. Tanakeran towiya imakiapie. Wasituya terra makiapie. Chansheape hemetha. Imijashka ewati. Imijashka imikapeye. Dakota yapi te uhindapi. Dakota yapi unspe michichie. Hanana pekate minowopina. And my name is Tara. My Dakota name is Tanakera. I currently live in St. Paul, but I'm from Lower Sioux, Dakota, and White Earth, Ojibwe. And today I'll be reading a poem, just one poem. But I wanted to kind of talk about how I got into writing. I'm really grateful to be with all these great writers. We learn a lot from Art, and I'm thankful to Angela. Our sessions have been good. We've visited with many authors, and we're just learning a lot, and I'm really grateful to be with all of you and hear all of your stories and our different aspects in writing, and what we're comfortable with and what we get pushed to be comfortable with. So it's all been great. But when I was young, I was raised by my grandmother, but when I was young, my dad was an artist and he would draw, and he was also a lead guitar in a band. So every time he would go with his band members to the studio, he would take me and they'd go into the booth and I would write stories outside of the booth. So I thought I was like super cool and I was like an artist at like 7. And he just taught me that he used art as a healing tool and a mechanism. So when I started school, I wasn't Miss Popular, and so I would tell stories out on the playground to make friends, and it worked. So I just knew it was my thing, and I've always loved to write. I am a storyteller at home. My son will tell you that. I'm constantly telling stories, and he is constantly telling me I should be done. The story's over. Yeah, so that's how I got into writing. When in 2019, I wrote over Grandparents Weekend, I wrote my first book, Takoja Walks with the Blue Moon Girl, and it was based off of my relationship with my grandmother. I sent that into Tom and Betsy Peacock from Black Bears and Blueberries Publishing, and Betsy called me back and she said she would love to publish that book. And then working with them has been phenomenal. They're like grandparents to me. And the next year I wrote Animals of Ni Mama Ki and Animals of Keawita and Dakota Yapi and Ojibwe. And then they gifted me my rights back to my books. So then I opened my own publishing, which is Blue Hummingbird Woman Publishing. And I also have a gift shop where I sell a whole bunch of Native art, which is my joy. I feel like some of our artists aren't good at representing or pushing their art, but I am. So I love that part. So yeah, that's how I got into writing. That's where I'm at now. I have books coming out with the History Center and Marlena Miles, We Are Capable Publishing, and then we'll be out later this year and next year. So this piece I'm gonna read to you today has been in my heart for about 18 years, since my son was born. And I always go back to it, never finalized it. Meeting with my writers, they just kind of pushed, and like, they're really good at making you feel comfortable and giving you really good criticism in a good way, right? So I was just like, you have to do this, you have to sit down and focus on this. And so this is the first time this is coming out of my mouth. It is written, finalized, but it's an emotional poem for me, so bear with me. It's called Protect Your Queen. I'm gonna take a drink of water. Maybe the reason I admired her when I was young is because she resembled me. I would watch her from afar, sometimes even mimicking the way she always looked over her shoulder. I often wondered what she was running from or what she left behind. Was it her heart or her mind that was always on the go? Year after year, I watched as she seemed to play hide and seek with herself. Constantly 2 steps ahead of me and always changing. I could never keep up. I was just too small. Substances continued to cover her like a shield from reality, and I just wanted to save her. So almost achingly, I held her hand as tight as I could, whenever I could, never noticing how the grip was actually hurting me. Soon I noticed I was a player in these games too. These games were never ending, players would come and go, and there's never a winner. Still, I would play the pawn, following her every move, hoping one of us would find our way to home base or just break even. Over time, we had become 2 lost girls. We were addicted. Time snuck up on me. This vicious tournament had taken all my pieces and left me alone on the board. She had gotten so good at hiding, I could no longer seek her. In a moment of complete desperation and rage, I flipped the fucking board upside down. I don't remember where the pieces went, and finally, I didn't care. All grown up now with lasting harsh memories of a game I have come to loathe. As a storyteller, I rewrite our story in my heart all the time. Unfortunately, this trauma still lingers. I should have told her she was never my opponent. She was so much more worthy than that. She was worthy. More worthy than being stuck on a board where the odds were always stacked against her, never having a chance to win. These days, I look over my shoulder, gazing back at a life before the game, like she used to. I still mimic her in that way. I wish I could find her now, to let her know the game wasn't passed down to my sons. They are free. I'd hug her so tight and whisper, flip the fucking board, Mom. It's never too late.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. All right, moving on to our next writer with M Poupart. Come on up.
Really bad at speaking into mic, so I might get louder, I might get quiet. Thanks for being here, everybody. It's amazing to kind of come from somewhere of nervousness and kind of having a lot of support once you're up here. My name is Poupart. I'm from Black Flambeau, Wisconsin. I do fiction writing, nonfiction, bit of poetry, bit of everything. And I work at Birchbark Books, which is the best place in the whole world. I'm going to be reading a bit of fiction tonight. I started this story early this year and had to take a really long break from it. It's got a lot of themes of like climate apocalypse and kind of dystopian themes. And as someone who kind of carries a bit of climate anxiety all the time, every day, it got a bit much, and it didn't really come from a place of hope, which is where I wanted to sit more so. It's far from done, and it doesn't have a title, but I am hoping to make kind of more vignettes and kind of more parts to the story and expand the world a bit more. So here we go. The Sandbox Corp antechamber was a metal room with 2 sets of doors on opposite walls. Shingosh had hesitated before she stepped inside, feeling the same pit in her stomach that she felt when she got into elevators. A family with a young girl stepped around her, all dressed in matching powder blue snowsuits. Then a pair of men shuffled in, mumbling "excuse me's," before settling in the corner closest to the opposite doors. The group supervisor appeared out of thin air behind Shingosh, wearing a puffball hat and a knitted scarf. "Nervous?" she asked. "Some people are their first time here, but don't worry, you're gonna have a blast." "Oh," Shingosh said. "No, it's not that. This just feels like an elevator." She gestured to the antechamber. "That's because it is an elevator," the supervisor smiled. "It'll take us about a minute to reach your floor. In the meantime, I need to remind you of our policies and safety guidelines." She gestured for Shingosh to enter. She did, her knees suddenly wobbly, and pressed herself close to the wall. The door slid shut and the room shifted, starting its ascent. The supervisor turned to face everyone. "All right, folks, this is just a reminder that although you will be experiencing a controlled environment, this does not negate the chance of hypothermia or frostbite. If you're experiencing excessive shivering, exhaustion, or confusion, or if you lose sensation in any of your extremities, please notify me and we will remove you from the simulation and administer first aid in the antechamber." Shingosh had known the supervisor's name at some point, but now couldn't remember it to save her life. She shifted awkwardly and warm in her layered clothing, a pair of leggings under sweatpants and a hoodie under a windbreaker. She tried not to look at anyone, but couldn't help but stare at the silver boots the family to her left adorned. Their little girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but she was wearing winter boots. Shingosh couldn't make sense of it, but still felt a squeeze in her chest. The family had good money, enough to get matching snowsuits, enough to buy new boots whenever their daughter's toes curled against her old ones, enough to make visiting this place a habit, to not even flinch at the bank statement after making a reservation here. "Your experience will last exactly 45 minutes, the supervisor continued. "I will blow my whistle once, 5 minutes before your time is up, and twice once you return to the antechamber. For those of you who have purchased a 15-minute extension, you may disregard my whistle until I blow it 3 times, indicating that your extension is over. Is there anyone who would like to purchase an extension now?" Shingosh stared at the floor, but shook her head no. She couldn't afford it, having already scraped money together for most of the year to come here. She'd once rolled her eyes at the idea of paying money to experience a season, something she should have been able to step outside and feel for free. But the last person in her family to witness snow had been her great-grandmother when she was in her 20s. Shingosh only heard stories as a child about powder and storms and lakes. Her grandmother's eyes softened when she talked about life before, when there were birds, when leaves fell from the trees and grew back in the spring. When Shingosh's great-grandmother died, the stories died with her. There were photos, of course, and the internet, but it wasn't the same. Now the high in the city on a good night was well over 100 degrees at any given time of year. Her mother's generation had been the one to make the hard-fought decision to change business and working hours to nighttime and shut themselves into their houses when the sun was up and the air was at its most unbearable. Now here she and her brother were, waiting for the world to heal from scars of centuries of exploitation. Shingosh never thought she would see snow until she started having visions about a year ago. It started with dreams of storms, then deep forests, frosted and white. Lights gleamed in the sky, clouds of wind and snow danced on the frozen surfaces of lakes. The air was cold and sharp, and her whole body was shaking when she woke up, drenched with sweat. When her bed had become too warm to sleep in, Jingosh sprawled on the linoleum floor of her apartment, with ice packs and frozen towels under her back and neck. She lived on piercingly cold showers, sometimes twice a day, but it was never enough to shake the permanent fever that lived on her skin, her scalp, under her fingernails. Sleep was a relief, but it was never enough. She knew of this place before the vision started and swore she would never come here, but here she was, after saving whatever dollars she could spare. It wasn't enough to see it in her dreams anymore, as real as the bite of cold felt as it washed through her lungs and hair. As ashamed as she was, she needed this. The supervisor was reminding them of the waiver and the NDA they had signed, but Jingosh wasn't listening. Cut the bullshit, she thought, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Just let me in there. There was a room, if it could be called that, the size of a city block. There were a few pictures available online of what lived behind the steel doors in front of her, but what she should hold her breath for. But every advertisement for this place promised authenticity, the experience of a lifetime. Phones weren't allowed. Participants turned them over to the unnecessarily buff security guy, who locked them all in a metal box and kept it under his enormous bicep. The antechamber settled with a final clank. Sweat gathered in Jingosh's armpits and along her hairline. Is everyone ready? The supervisor stepped to the side. Here we go. The door slid open. Wind swept into the antechamber, then flushed itself out. It swept Jingosh's breath away, sucking everyone a few steps forward. Jingosh turned away from the jarring brightness, cussing silently, then squinted at the scene in front of her. Her breath caught, then it felt like her entire body was buzzing. In front of her wasn't a concrete room, but a bright blue sky, a short clearing that sloped into a hill blanketed in snow and trees. So many trees. The snow was fresh, free from tracks and footprints. Wind gusted into the chamber again, and Jingosh's chest clenched as she watched snowflakes fly. Her arms felt numb. All right, everyone, the supervisor said brightly. Your 45 minutes starts now. You may move freely through the sandbox, or if you prefer a guided experience, stick with me. The little girl darted out, her parents behind her as she flung herself into a snowdrift and began waving her arms and legs. The couple trailed out, their hands locked together. Envy elbowed Jingosh's stomach, but she couldn't resent a child. There were a million reasons why Jingosh couldn't spend her childhood wearing matching snowsuits with her parents, jumping into snowbanks, pink-cheeked and giggling. She swiped at the tears under her eyes and stepped into the cold. The snow crunched under her feet. The feeling was one she'd felt in her dreams, but this time she wasn't going to wake up. The wind came again, flapping against her windbreaker and whisked away the sweat on her face. Jingosh tried not to feel disappointed that she had felt colder winds in her sleep as she wandered away from the group and towards a grove of pine trees. In the solitude, it was quieter, and as she wandered, Jingosh grabbed a random pine branch and pressed it to her face, inhaling deeply the smell of real pine, not just the artificial stuff they put in candles. Woody and green and somehow sweet. She glanced around before snapping off the end of a branch and stuffing it into her hoodie, where it tickled against her chest. This was probably violating some kind of rule, but Jingosh didn't care. She shoved her hand into the pocket of her sweatpants and pulled out a pinch of tobacco. Miigwech, she whispered, depositing it at the base of the tree she had taken from. She walked further until the trees became so thick they formed a wall. Well, it had to end somewhere, Jingosh thought. It was finally quiet here. A gust of wind came in through the insulation of branches, sending loose snow twirling and chiming through the pine grove, whispering until it came to rest on the forest floor once more. Jingosh watched, her heart prancing in her chest. The snow was deeper here, coming most of the way up to her calves. Jingosh could feel it start to invade her boots and socks, but didn't care in the slightest. She crouched, her lower back and knees cringing, then brought herself to the ground with a grunt. The snow gave under her weight and then formed a cradle around her figure. She lay still, listening. There was her breath, raspy, leaving her nose and mouth in gusts she could see. She'd seen this before. She dug in the snow with a bare hand and brought a fistful to her mouth. Cold, clear, probably cleaner than any tap water she'd ever had in her life. Probably cleaner than bottled water, too. She ate another fistful and laughed. The rules didn't say anything about eating snow, and she was going to get her fill. Jingosh blinked and watched artificial sunlight glance between overhead bows as they swayed and creaked. The cold had begun to soak through her jacket and pants. Let it, she thought. I paid too much money to not get hypothermia. Something flashed overhead, a blue and gray caped shape lighting to a branch somewhere out of Jingosh's field of vision. She lurched upwards, scanning for movement. The silence was broken by a loud cheer, and Jingosh finally found him. It took her a moment to remember his name, but she grinned when she did. Dindisi, she breathed. Boujou. The blue jay jeered at her again, peering at her with a cold black eye. He wasn't as blue as photos had led her to believe, but he was here. Overwhelmed, Jingosh began to cry hot, thick tears. Is it only you here? Jingosh whispered. Dindisi shifted on his branch, fluttering his wings as the wind came in again. He had to be real. He just had to. She reached for another pinch of tobacco, and the blue jay shrieked at her movement. Jingosh sniffed, then laughed a bit. Of course, the only blue jay she'd ever seen in real life would scold her. Her great-grandmother had told her stories of how they were territorial, chasing away squirrels and crows from their homes, with calls loud enough to draw the neighborhood's attention. Jingosh placed the tobacco on the snow next to her. Dindisi gave one final screech before disappearing with a flash of blue and gray. Jingosh closed her eyes, burning the image into her memory. The air was still again, and she let herself absorb the chill. She inhaled. The air stuck to the inside of her nose. Exhaled. Heat leaving her body. Inhale. Exhale. Excuse me, miss. When Jingosh opened her eyes, the supervisor's bleary face was over hers. Huh? What? She shuffled in the snow, barely feeling her limbs. Her head felt heavy as she tried to sit up. Your reservation ended 6 minutes ago. We would offer you an extension, but you have already declined and you will likely need first aid. Please come with me. The supervisor's voice carried a seriousness that Jingosh didn't realize. Huh? She tried to sit up again. The snow had melted into her pants and sweater, and the wet material clung to her body. The supervisor stepped back, and Jingosh could see the security guard standing behind her, one hand on his walkie-talkie, the other resting on the baton on his hip. Seriously? Jingosh thought. She made it to her knees before the supervisor gave her an arm up. You fell asleep. Your reservation ended 7 minutes ago. Let's go. The supervisor gave her arm a tug and began striding with ease through the snow. Jingosh stumbled behind her, the hair on her neck bristling as the security guard followed at her heels. Did you see Dindisi? Jingosh asked. What? The blue jay? Oh. The supervisor's shoulders relaxed a bit. Yes, we've got two in this environment, a male and a female. They were allotted to us by the ARC, but as clones, they won't be able to breed, unfortunately. We tried squirrels here once, but too many people attempted to steal them. Oh. Jingosh thought hard. Her brother worked at the ARC, but with reptilian conservation, not avian. Did he know about this? She shook her head. She'd ask him later, NDA be damned. Her heart stuttered as the trio exited the pine grove, and she was washed with artificial sunlight. Across the clearing, the little girl and her parents had begun stacking balls of snow. They didn't look in her direction. Jingosh wanted to believe that she'd gotten her fill and would never come here again. The price alone was enough to ensure that she'd never look back. But the snow had been a balm, and she could finally taste and feel it. A century ago, she'd be able to live in it, and now here it was. The smell of pine and ice, the screech of Dindisi, locked behind concrete walls and metal doors. Jingosh buried her fists in the pocket of her sweater and inhaled through her nose again and again and again, feeling the bite, the way it crawled up her sinuses. Silently, she made peace with the fact that she was going to be doubling her work hours to come to this place again, and soon. When they reached the antechamber, Jingosh turned, feeling one last cold kiss on her cheek before the double metal doors slid shut, sealing away that wonderland. 2 men in medical gear approached her with heavy towels. We'll need you to remove your sweater, one told her. No, thank you. Really, I'm fine. I'm not even shivering. The medics looked at each other, alarmed, then began moving forward with towels. Jingosh jerked away. Don't touch me. I'm fine. You have hypothermia. We will need to warm you up before you leave. One medic began to pull at her windbreaker. Jingosh shoved him away. Don't fucking touch me. I'm fine. She was beginning to thaw and her hands and legs shook. The feeling made her frantic and she curled to her knees. Please, I just want to be cold. The security guard had a firm grip on his baton now, but the supervisor put a hand in front of him. Just leave her alone, the supervisor muttered. We get ones like this, they get it together eventually. For a moment, nobody moved. The antechamber lurched and Jingosh squeezed her eyes shut, wrapping her arms around her legs. A towel was placed over her shoulders, the other dropped in front of her. The supervisor cleared her throat. When we reach the lobby, we will give you back your phone. You will receive a complimentary sweatsuit that you can change into in the locker room. If you would like any more medical attention before you leave, please let us know. Once you leave Sandbox property, you are responsible for your own health. Do you understand? Jingosh shook her head yes. A verbal affirmation is required, the supervisor said. Yes, she said. Yes, I understand. Her skin ached and her wet clothes had begun to itch. She opened her eyes and stared at the towel in front of her. She could feel the supervisor's scowl and cringed at the thought of ever seeing her again. Embarrassment and anger roiled in her stomach. It was her fault for falling asleep, but fuck. Remember Dindisi, she told herself. Not this. Remember the trees. Jingosh stood, pain shooting through her back. Dindisi, the trees, the way the snow glitters in the sun. It was almost like her dreams. Almost. The antechamber settled and the doors slid open. Jingosh stepped forward into the wide lobby and took her things from an attendant waiting by the doors. The sweatsuit was emblazoned with a red and white beach ball, the Sandbox Corp logo. Jingosh turned away and towards the locker room, letting her wet clothes drip against the expensive tile floors. She was alone in the locker room as she undressed, peeling off the windbreaker and then her hoodie. The pine branch was in her hands again, and she held it to her nose for a long inhale before concealing it in her wet clothes. She'd give this one to her brother, she decided with a smile. When she came back, the next one would be hers.
Can't wait to read the whole thing. All right, we have one final author tonight, Tara Widner, come on up. Thanks. Thank you.
All this high-tech pen and paper. Bonjour, que te ganas con que te da indígena cosma cuando de Miigwech. My name is Tara Widner, and before I go any further, I just want to thank everybody for coming here tonight, and thank all my relations, Art and Angela, and all of our support, all of the authors in the cohort. They really have been inspiring for this whole process. And I want to also do a shout out to the group that came before us, and a big thanks to NACDI and Manoma. My name is Tara Widner. I'm Pemminavano Ojibwe. I'm of lineal descent of one of the treaty signers of the Treaty of Old Crossing, 1863. My family was shuffled between Red Lake, Turtle Mountain, and ended up with a land allotment on White Earth outside of Monoman. I'm a Navy veteran, a corpsman, a medic, long before the perpetual wars we had in the Middle East over war. I took an oath to protect this land and the US Constitution. to defend it, and including in that Constitution, Article 6, the Supremacy Clause that holds treaties to the highest law of the land. Treaties between the Ojibwe and the US government, treaties between the Dakota people, Ojibwe, and the US government, and all of the other treaties the US made and have broken. In those treaties, those Ojibwe treaties, there's mention, specific mention, that we have the right to hunt, fish, trap, and gather wild rice. Wild rice is held to that highest standard. Much of what I write these days contains some version of what I just told you. And it's directed to every single branch of the US government, whether it is state, local, county, federal government, whether it's the governor, whether it's the attorney general, the Army Corps, or the president, or even these days, the judges. All of that is public record, and you can look it up. And I write to tell them my opposition of these extractive industries, mines and pipelines that are destroying our NACDI and our Manoma. And I write to tell them to honor the treaties. So, and now with this cohort, I've been doing a little creative nonfiction, and I'd like to tell you 2 short little stories, both of them about ricing. The first one's called Old Town. I was already late. It was still hours before daybreak. The smell of coffee was my thin tether to the waking world. I tuned the radio of the res station on Leech Lake, the Eagle. I was in luck. I caught a syndicated show out of the West that always rocks, and I rolled down the windows to stay focused. A heavy fog had settled in overnight, as it does in the spring and the fall of the water-rich north woods of Minnesota. The dashed reflective center line flashed in a tempting hypnotic rhythm, the only thing visible on the road. I had known this stretch of highway my whole life, even in my dreams. Several times each summer, the county road crews would tame the woods away from the road. Each time the forest would reach back to hug the asphalt path. Now they used what we call a Lorax, a large tractor whipping a chain around, tearing everything down in its path. Decades ago, it was the rainbow of toxins Monsanto created. Defoliants in different colored barrels, orange, pink, or was it purple, sprayed from tanker trucks. Each time the green came back, changed from a new effort to kill it off. The mist from outside the window felt fuzzy, a blurry blanket beckoning me back into the comfort of a warm bed. The start of the semester had been a rough few weeks, returning to a classroom after 15 years from a detour I'd taken into a career that was no longer my anchor. Unmoored, I returned to the woods of my childhood nostalgia to finish a long winding path to a degree, any accomplishment, desperately trying to hold on to something that would keep my head above water. Being a population 110. The sign stood like a ghostly sentry. I passed it, missing my turnoff. I'd been up and down this highway hundreds of times, but it never stopped. I turned around in the strikingly out of place gas station at the highway intersection. The white wooden store trimmed boldly in red, blue. It had never been open when I passed through, and it wasn't open now, but it looked like it would at some point in the day, in contrast to the years that it stood dull and abandoned. I pulled back onto the highway after revisiting my written directions, passing an old vacation resort, and I took the turn towards the lake down Old Housing Road. I'd counted off that number of houses, 5 houses on the right. There was a red Old Town canoe in the front yard. It was a small 2-bedroom home, just like the 4 I'd passed, barely revealed in the fog. I pulled into the drive. I took one last gulp of coffee, gritty. and stepped onto the ground. The front door opened. "Hi, I'm Bonnie. You must be Tara. Come on in. We've been expecting you." "He's finishing up. Do you want some coffee?" she said, as the elder welcomed me into the gestured to the well-worn couch. The early morning local show was on the TV. "You're late," barked from another room. "Let me get my cup from the car and I can take the coffee along." It was a quick retreat to the porch and back to the warm car. I sat there for a moment with the urge to put the keys in the ignition, the cold and wet seeping into my bones, wondering what I'd gotten myself into when all I wanted to do was curl up in a tight ball and sleep through the weekend. I was too far in to turn back for bed. I grabbed the metal travel mug and went back inside. I walked through the door again, and Bonnie popped up from the couch and grabbed my mug, disappearing into the kitchen. I turned around in the center of the room, marveling at the adornment of the off-white walls, the weather report droning on in the background, painted tortoiseshell rattles, a dream catcher woven into a deer antler, a birch bark cone with wispy white Northwoods white sage dangling over the red willow lip, a large hand-painted picture of an old Indian in a headdress, shellacked to a dark stained wooden plaque in the center of one of the walls. Photographs and pictures drawn by children filled the remaining wall space, stick figures and butterflies. "We love you, Grandpa Buddy." A slow, slurry grumble. My daughter said, "You hear?" Startled, I whipped around. "Huh?" I listened closer, taking the old man in. He was a head shorter than me, slight build, and even though he was concealed under all those layers of clothes, I could see he was rail thin. "My daughter said you would be here at 6, he said, as he turned around and left the room. Bonnie returned. She handed me my steaming mug filled and signed to me, curling her fingers and pinky and thumb out, tilting it towards her mouth. "It's okay. He's better this way. You'll be safe." I had bought Monoman from the old man's daughter for years. When I moved back to Minnesota, I asked her if she knew anyone willing to teach the new Ricer. In grand fashion, she set me up with the baddest Niji ninja in the Northwoods and gave me directions to her father's place in Phoenix. The old man came back through the living room with 2 white seed bags full of gear. Wooden sticks were all I could make out. I followed him outside. He threw the bags down near my car and pulled out an old horse blanket. Flinging it across the top of my 4-door sedan, he nodded towards the other end of the old town. In a single swooping motion, we flipped the canoe and hoisted it on top of the car. I'd followed his lead without even realizing it. He disappeared around the house in the haze that hinted at twilight, and materialized back out of the mist with a long pole balanced on his shoulder, both hands clutching various lengths of mismatched rope and ratchet straps. In minutes, he had the canoe tied down the front, back, midsection of the Impala. He wedged the pole under the canoe seats and into the bow of the boat with similar ease. He opened the passenger door, slid inside, lit a Seneca red. "The season's over. The storm knocked all the Monoman down," he growled. From the driver's seat, I leaned in, straining to hear his words. "But I know a place nobody knows about. I'll find you some rice, my girl." I smiled as I turned the key ignition. He was still muttering, "It's back there with the alligators and pterodactyls." I let out a nervous laugh. Following his directions, a series of gesturing lips and head nods brought us from the known highway to a forest trail. It was an overgrown path roaring into the woods, not much wider than the car. I hesitated, uncertain that cars were even allowed to drive down it, but he nodded me forward. Slowly, the car crawled down the path, dipping into ruts and holes, the understory brushing and screeching against us in passing. Each time the path took a turn, I held my breath, my mind racing for what to do if we meet any oncoming vehicles. The old man, unbothered, lit another cigarette. Deeper into the forest, 10, 20, 30 minutes passed, maybe hours. My sense of time had been left behind on the highway. The canopy opened up and let the sky in. The sandy path widened enough for to allow another vehicle to pass. Park here, he snapped with a head motion. I pulled into the indentation. My shoulders dropped and I inhaled the pine. Are we allowed? I inhaled the pine. I had you worried, eh? He whispered, stepping out of the car and lighting another cigarette. Are we allowed to park here? He shrugged his shoulders and continued untying the old town, leaving the ropes dangling, nodding me to the other end of the canoe. I knew the basics of ricing. His daughter talked me through the process. It was much the same as our ancestors had done for hundreds of years. Two people in a canoe, one standing and pushing the canoe with a long pole through the shallows of a muddy river or lake where the manone likes to grow, and the other person sitting bends the stalks over and brushes the head of the plant with the ripe seeds falling into the bottom of the boat. Simple enough. And don't tip the canoe. The hazards, beards and bugs. I'm not squeamish, but the thought of spiders and worms crawling up my pants legs had me wrapping duct tape around my wrists and ankles. Covering each grain of monomen is a paper-thin husk with thousands or hundreds of barbs on a long, thin tail. It's called the beard, which is much more dangerous than any of the insect encounters out there. The beard is great for driving the seed deep into the mud, but not just the mud, eyes, ears, throat, belly button, and any other openings. I ran through the safety checklist: gum, in case beards in my eyes, floppy hat, wraparound glasses, shirt on backwards, duct tape, ankles, belly button. I decided to chance it not to duct tape any of the other suggestions. By the time I pulled myself together, he already had filled the canoe with gear and pulled it across the sandy path to a tiny hidden stream. He had returned for the cedar pole with a two-pronged fork on the end. It was a couple of feet longer than the car. I watched as he bent down and put some of the same in the water, and I followed his lead. Don't forget that part. It's for the water spirits and the monomen, he said as he shimmied up to the front of the canoe, already partially in the stream. He read my dumbfounded look as I stood on shore. You're my polar. Don't knock me in. It hadn't dawned on me to that moment that I was to be the one standing in the canoe. I'd only been in a canoe once, and it involved a lot of swimming, and they would let anyone rent a canoe on the St. Croix River with absolutely no experience or instruction. The next 15 minutes was spent rocking the canoe back and forth, still within sight of where we had put in. The stream began to widen, and I was starting to get the hang of using the pole, moving us forward more than pulling us backward with the pole stuck in the deep mud. Alligator, he snapped. Thud. The slow-moving canoe came to a stop. A fallen log had blocked the stream. Its massive trunk sat a couple inches above the water. The old man was out of the canoe, standing on the log, motioning me to the front and the opposite side. With both of us standing on the log, we pulled the canoe over the alligator and filed back in. Continuing down the stream, from my vantage point of standing, I could see the forest canopy opening ahead, and I knew it must be our destination, a rice bed. Alligator, thud. The old man was up and out of the canoe, motioning for me to repeat the process from before. I shimmied forward, counterbalancing my hands and feet, sliding them forward along the gunnel and out the back and out onto the back of the alligator. I stood up on what was not a tree. I raised up out of the stream by several inches, showing itself to be perfectly round in circumference. I knocked the cedar pole against it. It's metal. What is this? I asked. It's the pipeline, he replied, as we pulled the old town over it. Thank you. These were the knockers he made me. I have one more really short one, if you bear with me. It's called Pale. And it's another racing story. The scream pierces the silence of the night. It startles me alert. Was it really a scream? I sit still wondering. All I can hear is the thud, the thud, the thud, the thud of my own heart drowning out rationalizing thought. Another scream lashes out in the night. I stumble to my feet, trying to figure out which direction it's coming from. I grab for the door. I hear it again and freeze. I rise up on my toes and peer out the arched window above the door. My eyes adjust to the moon and street lights, and I see her walking down the middle of the road. She drops her shoulders down, arms back, and screams again. Screams again. It registers. She's naked, covered in blood. Why isn't anybody helping her? I'm confused. I go to the door. I snap up in a stiff sitting position in my tent, my dog tucked under the blanket, shivering hard, pushing against me. Just a dream, just a dream, just a dream, I tell myself. Why is the dog shivering? My hands patting for the phone. It's 4 a.m. One missed call. Nate, we should be here. We should be here around 4. Shift ran late. The scream breaks the silence. My ears fill with the scream. I fumble and press record on my phone, holding my breath, frozen, not daring making a sound. The scream fades, echoing between the two lakes and the elevated road. The silence this time gives way to an approaching car. I rip the zipper open. Dog and I bolt for the driveway. Nate, so glad to see you. None of the usual formalities. What's up? You okay? Do you see anything? We're sleeping inside tonight. Thank you. Thank you. You know, I've been doing a lot of work with water protectors and protecting Monoman. And a lot of people ask me, what's an indigenous solution to climate change, to polluted waters, the epidemic of missing and murdered indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and youth? What the answer is to indigenous homelessness. And it's a simple solution to all these problems. Land back. Yeah. Thank you. Me too.
All right, let's give all authors another round of applause. All right, well, before we conclude for the evening, I just want to take a minute to acknowledge and also to bring up the facilitator and mentor of this year's cohort, which is Art Coulson.
Hello, everybody, for coming out. As you can see, I'm probably the luckiest writer in the Twin Cities getting to work with these 12 phenomenal writers. I'm learning so much from them. It's not fair to call me the mentor because I feel like sometimes I'm being mentored by them as well. Again, thank you for coming out and showing your support for this year's group. The summer writing readings has been just one of the greatest experiences for me to hear, 12 writers of such different voices and, different genres, and to hear the stories that they tell. I feel like that uncle and, after the baby's been delivered and you're holding the baby for the first time, sitting there in the hospital, when I see these stories being born and I see them as they develop and they're taking their first steps, and I really can't wait to read the anthology when it comes out. And I hope you all will read it as well. Thanks again to all the writers. Another round of applause for them. We can't give them applause. And thank you to Angela, to Juliana, to all my relations arts, to NACDI, to everybody who's had a hand in this program. It's been just a wonderful experience, and I hope we just keep it going forever. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. That concludes our event for this evening. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. And yeah, that was the last of our 3 readings. And now, like, our next steps is going to be, these guys will be getting all of their works together for an anthology. So you'll be able to see that when that comes out. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on Zoom tonight. Please help yourself to any leftovers we have. And I also want to share that we do have an artist in the back. Justin Hawkins is here with some of his art and jewelry. So if you want to take a look as you're making your way out. Thank you for coming and have a great weekend, everybody.